Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 11, verse 2, which in the ESV reads, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom." Wow. By the way, guys, before we get into actually unpacking this video, I want to apologize for the noise in the background. Obviously, my neighbor is doing their lawn, or they're having someone else do it. But regardless, I understand that the work has to get done. So just bear with me. I hope that my voice can kind of mute that out a bit. But let's just set the stage here, because Proverbs 11:2 is one of those verses that is short enough to memorize in 30 seconds, basically, but deep enough to spend a lifetime unpacking. It's a classic antithetical couplet in the style we have been tracing through chapter 10, two contrasting realities set side by side with surgical precision. But what makes this verse particularly striking is its structure. The first line moves in sequence. Pride comes, then disgrace comes. There is a cause and effect built right into this grammar. Solomon is not saying pride and disgrace occasionally show up together. He is saying pride is the mechanism that produces disgrace. It is not a coincidence. It's a pipeline. And the second line does not mirror that sequence, though. It simply states a condition. With the humble is wisdom. Not humility comes, then wisdom comes. Just wherever you find humility, wisdom is already there. So the contrast in structure reinforces the contrast in content. Pride is dynamic and destructive, always moving towards something bad, but humility is stable and generative, simply existing in a state where wisdom is present. And so let's talk about this part of the verse, the first part where it says, "Where pride comes, then comes disgrace." The Hebrew word for pride here is zedon, which carries a stronger charge than the English word pride typically suggests. Zedon does not describe a healthy self-respect or appropriate confidence. It describes presumption, arrogance, and the specific kind of pride that actively oversteps its rightful boundaries. It is the pride of someone who has decided they are above accountability, above correction, and above the natural limits that apply to everyone else. This is the same word used back in Deuteronomy 17:12 for the person who refuses to listen to the priest or judge and acts presumptuously. It is a word associated with deliberate, knowing overreach. Zedon is not an accident. It is a posture someone settles into when they have decided their own judgment and status are sufficient without reference to God or other people. And the word comes in Hebrew appears twice in the first line, and it is worth noting. Pride comes, disgrace comes, and the repetition here creates a kind of inevitability. One arrival triggers the other. So Solomon is not describing a scenario where pride sometimes leads to disgrace if circumstances go badly. No, he is describing pride as a self-executing problem. The arrival of Zedon sets the disgrace in motion regardless of external circumstances. And then disgrace in Hebrew is kelon, which refers to shame, dishonor, and the public loss of the reputation that pride was working so hard to protect and elevate. This is the great irony embedded in the verse. Pride is fundamentally about self-elevation, about making ourselves appear greater, more capable, more worthy of respect than we actually are. And the thing it reliably produces is the precise opposite of what it was reaching for. It goes up reaching for honor and lands in disgrace. And then the biblical record is essentially a running catalog of this exact pattern. Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4 is perhaps the most dramatic illustration. At the height of his power, he looks out over Babylon and says, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" Before the words are finished leaving his mouth, a voice from heaven announces his judgment. He spends 7 years eating grass like an ox until he acknowledges that heaven rules. Then pride came, the disgrace followed, and the pipeline worked exactly as described. Let's move on now to the part of the verse that says, "But with the humble is wisdom," because I believe the second line is quieter than the first, which is fitting because humility itself tends to be quieter than pride. Where the first line had movement and sequence, this line simply describes a state of being. The humble do not arrive at wisdom through a dramatic process. Wisdom is simply with them. The Hebrew word for humble here is senuim, which describes people who are modest, unassuming, and appropriately low in their self-estimation. This is not false modesty or performative self-deprecation, the kind of humility that is really just pride wearing a disguise to get compliments of how humble you are. Rather, senuim describes a genuine orientation of the heart that accurately perceives its own position before God and other people. C.S. Lewis gave what is probably the best modern definition of this when he wrote in Mere Christianity that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. The humble person is not constantly running a self-assessment in either direction, either inflating themselves or deflating themselves. They are simply not that preoccupied with the question of their own status. Then wisdom, which again, we've gone over this term so many times, but chokmah, right, in the Hebrew. It is the practical skill of living well, the capacity to navigate life in alignment with how God designed it to work. And Solomon says it simply with the humble, present, available, accompanying them. This makes so much intuitive sense when you think about it, because wisdom requires teachability. It requires the capacity to receive correction, to acknowledge what you do not know, to defer to understanding that is greater than your own. And pride structurally prevents all of those things. A person who is convinced they already know what they need to know is not in a position to receive what wisdom is offering. But humility creates exactly the kind of open posture that wisdom can actually work with. In James 4:6, he says it plainly. He says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Or gives favor to the humble in some translations, I know. The word opposes in the Greek, because in the New Testament it's written in Greek, is antitasomai, a military term meaning to arrange troops in battle formation against someone. God actively arranges himself in opposition to the proud, but to the humble he gives grace, which in this context includes the wisdom and favor that grace makes possible. The posture of the heart determines what God is able to give us. I want to talk about the pride paradox now, because one of the most theologically interesting dimensions of this verse is what we might call the pride paradox, right? Now, let me explain this a little bit. Pride is fundamentally driven by the desire for honor, status, and the good opinion of others. It is an engine of self-elevation, and yet it reliably produces the thing it is most desperate to avoid: disgrace and the loss of the honor it was chasing. Humility runs the same paradox, but in reverse, if you actually think about it. The humble person is not preoccupied with their own elevation. They are not working the room, managing their reputation, or positioning themselves for maximum recognition. And yet wisdom accompanies them, and with wisdom comes the kind of genuine honor that pride could never manufacture for itself. Jesus makes the same observation in the New Testament in Luke 14:11 with characteristic directness. He says, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." This is not just a moral principle. It is a description of how the kingdom of God operates. The normal human assumption is that self-promotion leads to elevation and self-humbling leads to being overlooked. But Jesus reverses the entire framework. The direction you push yourself is not the direction you end up going. So now I want to talk about pride in the modern context, because I think it is worth pausing to acknowledge that the word pride carries a different cultural weight today than it did when Solomon wrote this. Because in our current moment, pride is regularly celebrated as a virtue, as self-confidence, self-advocacy, and refusal to be diminished. And there are legitimate, healthy versions of those things that are not what Solomon is warning against. But the Zidon of Proverbs 11:2 is not self-respect. It is not the appropriate confidence that comes from genuine competence. No. It is the presumptuous overreach of someone who has decided they're above the constraints, accountabilities, and corrections that apply to everyone else. It is the pride that refuses to acknowledge God, dismissing the counsel of others, and operates as if its own judgment is the final word on everything. Healthy confidence acknowledges both what it knows and what it does not know. It welcomes accountability because it is not threatened by correction. It can receive criticism without collapsing because its identity is not entirely dependent on being right. Zidane, by contrast, cannot receive any of those things because its entire architecture depends on the fiction of self-sufficiency and superiority. And so the diagnostic question here is not, do I feel confident, but can I be corrected? And the answer to that question reveals which of the two kinds of self-assessment we are actually operating with. And so now I want to get practical. Now I want to get applicable because, as I always say, that's where we turn the knowledge into action, which is one of the things that I struggle most greatly in my own life. And, just to kind of, talk about my own life anecdotally here. I've said this before in a previous video. I'm not a prideful guy. That's not one of the sins I struggle most with, because I struggle with, pride and what am I saying? I struggle with like lust and greed more and like laziness more, but I don't struggle too badly with pride. But I think what I do struggle with is humility, in the sense that, like, I want to have real humility, I don't just want to act humble, right? I don't want to act humble to look like, oh, this guy is so humble. No, I want to actually understand deeply how undeserving I am of God's grace in my own life, and then subsequently act out of that realization. And so that's what I think I need to work more on in my own life. And I can only get there through prayer, I believe. And so I need to definitely work on that for sure. But let's get to the practical applications here. The first thing is to let this grace function as a diagnostic, not just a consequence, because when we experience the disgrace that pride produces, whether it's a public failure, a relationship damaged by arrogance, or the loss of influence we overestimated ourselves having, the natural human response is to manage the fallout and protect whatever reputation remains. But Proverbs 11:2 suggests that the disgrace itself is pointing at something. If the pipeline runs from pride to disgrace, then disgrace is the downstream evidence of upstream pride. The more useful response to moments of disgrace is not reputation management, but honest examination of what kind of pride produced it. That examination, as painful as it is exactly the kind of thing the humble person is willing to do and the proud person is not. The second thing is to practice the specific discipline of crediting others. I think one of the most practical and concrete expressions of humility is the habit of genuinely crediting the people who contributed to anything we accomplish. I think pride tends to compress the narrative of success until it is primarily about us. But humility tells the fuller, truer story that almost always includes teachers, mentors, community, and just the sufficient grace of God. Making a consistent habit of this in conversations is how we tell our own story, in how we present our work, is not just socially gracious. It is the practice of accurate self-perception, which is what Sinuim actually describes. We are training ourselves to see reality as it is rather than as our ego prefers to present it. And then third, we got to cultivate the specific kind of humility that stays humble in success. I think the most dangerous moment for pride is not failure, where humility is almost forced on us by circumstances. It is success. When things are going well, when we are performing at a high level, when people are affirming us, that is when Zidane most easily takes root and when its presence is hardest to detect because it feels so much like justified confidence. Making a deliberate habit, though, of returning to God in gratitude during seasons of success, of acknowledging what we did not produce on our own, or maintaining accountability relationships even when we feel like we have outgrown the need for them, is the specific form of humility that Proverbs 11:2 is most urgently calling for. The person who stays humble in success is the one with whom wisdom remains. Let me just give some closing thoughts here. Proverbs 11:2 is 2 lines and perhaps 20 words, but it maps out one of the most consistent patterns in all of human existence. Pride overreaches and lands in disgrace. Humility settles into its proper place and finds wisdom already there waiting. This verse does not moralize or lecture. It simply describes the way things work, the same way you would describe gravity or the way seasons change. Pride produces disgrace the way a seed produces a plant, not occasionally, not under certain conditions, reliably, structurally, because that is the nature of what pride is and what disgrace is. So the invitation in the second line is quiet but genuine. Wisdom is not hiding. It is not reserved for the exceptionally gifted or the formally educated. It is with the humble. And humility, as it turns out, is available to all of us. We just have to want it more than we want to be right.